Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the School of Public Affairs at CU Denver First Friday series. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As regulars from the past know, this series is usually a breakfast in the terrace room at 1380 Lawrence Street, and of course we can't do that in the current time, so we're doing it virtually. This is our second one this fall. We had one in September. And we will have more in November and December. In fact, November will be November 6th after the election, where we'll talk about the results of the election, kind of following up on today's conversation. I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. We have a terrific panel here. And for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about Colorado politics, ballots, election processes, candidates, the state of the political world at this point. Which is obviously a crazy one. 2020, in many ways, has been one of the weirdest years of all of our lives, probably, and got even a little weirder last night with the president and his wife contracting the coronavirus. And so you want to, all politics aside, we want to wish President Trump and his family the best in terms of health outcomes, along with the other, I guess it's about 7 million Americans and 35 million worldwide that have come down with this terrible virus. So I also want to thank Emma Martz and Tula Wellbrook from the School of Public Affairs who set this up. Thank you for attending. Just logistically, we're going to go at least at 1 o'clock. If you have audience questions that we don't get to by then, we'll go to 1:15. And thanks to our panel for being willing to stay on a little longer. The format will be that I'll ask our esteemed panel some questions, and they can go back and forth a little bit after that, but we'll start with the ballot topics, and then we'll go to the election procedures, mail-in voting in Colorado and other places, and then to the candidates, presidential race, Senate race, state legislature, and others in Colorado. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A below or in the chat. But in any case, we're very happy to have you here, and hopefully at the end of this, we'll all know a lot more about what the election is likely to look like. I mean, obviously nobody can predict that, and the way 2020 is going, we can't even predict what's going to happen tomorrow. But I'll first start by introducing our panel, and the idea is we're trying to be balanced here, and so Renee Hansen is with us. She's the Senior Vice President at Strategies 360. She has an undergraduate degree from CU Boulder and an MPA from the School of Public Affairs, so we're very proud that she's our alum, and she works on issues, I'd say, usually on the left of center, and so we really appreciate Renee taking the time to be here today. On the right of center, we have Michael Fields, who's the Director of Colorado Rising Action, working on a number of issues that we're talking about today. And Michael is from Chicago originally, I think, and has undergraduate degree from Valparaiso and a law degree from the University of Colorado Law School. He and his wife are also expecting their 4th child, like any minute. So we really appreciate Michael being here, especially under those circumstances. And then our sort of more neutral panelist, Andrew Kenney, is here. Andrew is from Colorado Public Radio. You've probably heard him. Often, if you listen to Colorado Public Radio, he has an undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is also my undergraduate alum area, so proud of that. Andrew has written for the Raleigh News and Observer and in Denver for Denverite and the Denver Post before he started at Colorado Public Radio. So again, thank you all for being here and doing this with us. You, the audience, if you clicked on some links, you probably got a 1-page summary of the 11 ballot initiatives that are, what we'll be voting on in the next month. We tried to group them a little bit. I had trouble keeping 11 in my head, even what they are, much less what they do. But there's basically 4 that are about fiscal policy, tax changes, Gallagher, taxing tobacco, etc. There's 2 that are about voting in terms of every citizen versus only citizens and the popular vote electoral college issue that's going on around the country. There's 2 that are about social policy, one about abortion limitations and one about paid family and medical leave. There's 2 about gambling, which in my mind are a little less important than some of these others. And there's one about the reintroduction of the gray wolves in Western Colorado, which I'm sure is important in many areas, but maybe not quite as important as some of these others as well. But that's the background. As if you live in Denver, you also may know, or you will know soon when you see your ballot, there's another 11 Denver issues that range from municipal broadband to pit bulls to sort of the relative power of the city council versus the mayor, to taxes on Denverites for homelessness and for climate action, and a few others. So lots going on. Your ballot's really full, and we hope to help you sort that out and understand it a little bit better today. So let's jump in with the statewide ballot initiatives, these 11 ones that are out there. And maybe I'll start with Renee and ask her, what are the most important ballot initiatives from your perspective, or the most interesting ones that you want to highlight today?
Sure. Thanks, Dean Teskey, and thank you all for joining us today. I think you started us off on the right foot, which is talking about coronavirus and the change in the times. And I think this is really offering us a unique opportunity to really look at how our economy works. So my top three are actually 118, which is paid family leave, 116, which is the income tax reduction, and Amendment B, which is repealing Gallagher. So really quickly on 118, 80% of Coloradans do not have access to paid family leave. And most of those are women, people of color, lower income, and they need it. 1 in 4 women are having to go back to work 2 weeks after giving birth because they can't afford to stay home longer. I think this really will have a huge impact on our economy as we're recovering. Another one that will have a huge impact is 116, that's the income tax reduction. I am not supporting that ballot initiative, and that's because 75% of Coloradans, you're only going to see $50 or less. Average Coloradan will get like $37. But those who make over $500,000, they'll see 50% of the money, and the budget is going to take a huge hit. You're looking at $150+ million hit from this ballot initiative when we're still looking at trying to cut billions out of Colorado's budget, and that'll come out of our schools. Which takes me to Amendment B, which is the repeal of Gallagher. This one's a tough one to understand. There's a couple of them on this ballot, actually, that I think are incredibly difficult to sort of grasp and understand what's going on. So people are going to have to really do a lot of research. That's why people like Andy and the rest of our press are so valuable in kind of helping people understand the pros and cons. But Gallagher is a fiscal rule that was put in place before Tabor. And the way it interacts with Tabor is really harming our economy, and especially harming the ability for several of our districts, such as schools, health districts, fire districts, be able to continue raising the taxes they need to provide services for our communities. So those are my top three. But of course, actually, I think there's a whole bunch more that are super important, but you did ask me to limit to 3.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Renee, for getting us rolling. Michael, which ones do you think are most important and interesting?
Well, thanks for having me today. It's always great joining you all. I think, given that the fact that there's 11 ballot issues, I think all of them are important in some way, maybe except bingo, but that's important to somebody. But I think the fiscal issues are the issues that I also focus in a lot on. A lot of the work that I do, ballot issues tend to have a long-term impact on our state, things like Tabor, things like Gallagher, which have been around 30, 40 years, and adjustments to those always have a huge impact. And so the couple that I picked, one is Tabor related, which is one that I've worked on and helped write. I don't get to write the ballot language like legislators do, but write the statute. But one of them is Prop 117, and that has to do with voting on fees. And so part of our, the big part of Tabor is voting on tax increases. And this would basically say that if you're going to do a big new fee, $100 million or more, that you would have to go to get voter approval, because that is one of the holes right now in Tabor is they can charge fees and big fees that look a lot like taxes. And so I thought that was important to bring to voters to see if they want to weigh in on those types of things. The other one is one that's already been mentioned, but Amendment B, the Gallagher repeal. It's been something that we've been talking about for a lot of years. It helps keep residential property taxes low. And so one thing that I'm trying to get across is while there are issues with Gallagher, we need to reform Gallagher because of certain areas in the state, the home prices don't go up as fast as they do in the metro area. We need to reform it, but this isn't the right move, given that residential property taxes will be higher if it passes, and it doesn't really help businesses. And so these are complex issues. I hope people dig in their blue book and in all the information out there, because they do have long-term impact.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Andrew, from your perspective, what's interesting?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think that I also, not to repeat, but will be mostly watching the outcome of these fiscal-oriented measures, because I think it'll tell us a lot about where the state's electorate is at. I was saying earlier to Paul that I could foresee an outcome where, it's a total blowout and President Trump loses the state by a wide margin, and yet voters still decide to cut income taxes or to vote for these measures that are more conservative aligned. Or we could see a total mixed bag where, voters simultaneously decide that they want more restrictions on fees, and yet they also approve the new paid family leave program. Because in the past, despite Colorado voters' rap for being progressive at the ballot box and approving legal cannabis, they also are very, very hesitant to approve much of anything in the new in the way of spending. And this year we'll see if that's any different in terms of getting them to approve funding by way of a fee for this major new social program, paid family leave, or can folks on the left convince them that the state actually needs to keep all the tax revenue that it has and we shouldn't reduce the income tax. It's the ballot box is a really powerful tool, especially, even with Republicans not holding power in the chambers of the state legislature. They have successfully used it to limit the spending of the state government, and this year will tell us more about how that will look in the future.
Great. So sticking to the fiscal questions, I guess the tax on nicotine products, both tobacco and vaping, that is one area where Colorado voters in the past have approved sort of sin taxes on tobacco, on marijuana, gambling, if you think of it that way. What do people think of that one? And also ask, which of these do you think are going to pass? I know it's hard to predict in this crazy environment, and there isn't a lot of polling, but what's your sense? Maybe we'll go backwards and start with Andrew first.
Yeah, that proposition, is it EE on tobacco is a really interesting one, because it makes for strange bedfellows, as one of the campaign spokespeople was telling me the other day, where it's obviously a sales tax, so it's a regressive tax. That cost is borne most heavily by people with the lowest income. But you've also seen these sin taxes used by progressives, including in New York, where they want to raise prices to discourage people from using unhealthy products. So you've got this kind of conflicting values where things are kind of flipped on their heads from what you might normally expect. And as for what I think will happen with it's going to be actually a pretty big campaign on that one from what I've seen. There's already 80 billboards up around the state. The anti-message on that tobacco tax increase is very much focused on the tax message and saying, let's not give the government any more of our money to spend. And I'm not really sure what's going to happen with that. It's just going to be a tricky argument to make. Were you also asking which ones I think were most likely to pass?
Yeah, do the other ones, fiscal ones, you think likely to pass or no?
I have no idea.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is not an area where, we see regular polling. But let's move on. And Michael, what do you think about EE and the chances of passing on these others?
Yeah, I think EE is interesting because the last time a nicotine tax was on the ballot, it went down narrowly, but you had Altria spending close to $20 million against it. In this case, they're sitting out, and part of the reason is because there's also a floor, a price floor in EE that basically says you have to sell a pack of cigarettes for a certain amount of money, which really knocks out a lot of the market. And, some of these bigger players can get more of the market. And I think that's something that will be challenged that I think is actually unconstitutional. I mean, you can't say, every hotel room has to be $250 or over. What happens to Motel 6 and other places. And so I think there's an issue with that. I think the fact that it, will eventually go to pre-K, that it is a sin tax. I think it has a good shot of passing. I think out of the ones that I think will probably pass, I think that one is likely to pass. I think the tax cut is likely to pass, and probably family leave will likely pass. Would be the three that I would say are pretty certain that those things will pass. And they're obviously different, right? Family leave and a tax cut is interesting. And it's interesting our state picks and chooses that way. But I think the fact that there's not a whole lot of money, there will be some money spent against EE, but not the same amount as last time. I think it has a pretty good shot.
Great. Thanks. Renee?
Yeah, I think where the money goes to out of EE is one of the most interesting arguments, and one of the places where my heart lies. Early childhood education is one of the greatest equalizers in our communities, and our folks need that support. When preschool is as expensive as college for some folks, these dollars are going to be well spent. And so I think that makes an interesting argument for EE. I do believe it will pass. It failed once before, but it passed before that. And so I think the one thing that's really interesting about fiscal initiatives, and I've actually been having this conversation with several reporters, is Colorado actually really does read their ballot and really does do a very good job of thinking through sort of what each of these mean, but they also have a different impact on the state level and the local level, because you're also seeing a whole bunch of fiscal issues at the local level that are being considered as well. And I think Colorado is used to these longer ballots, although this one is pretty big. If you got your blue book, it sort of looks like a phone book this year. But I think that folks will do a really good job. So I think that Amendment B will actually squeak by. I think that folks will decide to repeal Gallagher. And I do believe that is because Michael just laughed at me. It's weird being not in the same room, Michael. You and I are so used to playing off of each other a little bit. But I do think it squeaks by. I don't think it goes by a lot. But part of that is actually because of one of Michael's favorite initiatives, and that's Tabor. So those property tax rates actually can't increase without a vote of the people. So I think our voters will understand that and will actually repeal Gallagher. I do think nicotine passes. I actually, unfortunately, currently think the state income tax reduction passes, but I will tell you we're working awful hard to make sure that doesn't happen. The problem is it's a 20-word question that seems really nice, because you have to really dig in to understand it's not going to mean a lot for the average Coloradan. So we have our work cut out for us on that one, and really making people understand that it may look good in 20 words, but your checkbook isn't going to look that much better. And then 117, Michael and I couldn't disagree more on this one. It's probably the one that we're going to spend the most time on opposite sides of. But enterprise fees, and I can see that we've got a question in the Q&A around this, so I'm guessing you'll jump over in there, Paul, and we can talk more about that one. But I think this is the case of one of those questions on the ballot that's so confusing. I think voters vote no, because it's just too hard to even figure out what it necessarily means.
Let's, thank you. So it sounds like there's a little bit of consensus in terms of the likelihood of passing that the nicotine tax might, the tax cut might, the Gallagher, more disagreement. I think Michael mentioned paid family leave, but let's dig into the enterprise for a minute. This, as Michael said, has been seen as a way around Tabor. I believe the hospital provider fee fell into that category. I know way back when, early Tabor years, the University of Colorado and higher ed, became enterprises so that they weren't subject, tuition increases weren't subject to Tabor kinds of issues. So what are the key issues there, Renee, and we'll just go backwards again, that have you concerned about that one?
Actually, we should probably let Michael start. It's his issue. We should let him explain it a little bit.
Fair enough. Very good.
Sure. I think the big thing with enterprises is it made sense when they first started to have them be exempt from Tabor. You mentioned university system, totally makes sense. The park system, you pay $10 to go in the park. The money goes towards the park. The lottery, people can choose to participate in the lottery or not. I think those made a lot of sense. What we see more recently is moving towards things that are not choices, are not user-based necessarily. If you have to stay in the hospital, if you have to drive your car, are. Health insurance is a mandate now, and now they're putting fees on health insurance plans in order to fund things. So as it gets further and further away from truly choice and choosing to participate is what I'm concerned about, and seeing even something like family leave, was going to be a mandate and used as an enterprise. I'm glad we're voting on it, but the legislature could easily pass that without a vote of the people. And I just think voters should weigh in. And so looking at stuff like, a carbon fee or a gas fee, that they can just raise hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in the future. Just voters should, if it's a good idea, voters will approve it. And let's just put that in with the other tax increases that we have.
Renee, what's the argument against that?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about my bio, but the part that we didn't talk about is I'm actually from southeastern Colorado. And our rural hospitals are one of the largest benefactors of things like the hospital provider fee. And I really worry about what happens to our rural hospitals if we start messing with these fees. Mark actually asked in the Q&A if Prop 117 affects existing fee-based enterprises. And Michael answered no, but I disagree with his answer. And part of that is because for existing enterprises, such as one of the universities, if you take too many dollars in terms of how you build your buildings, you fall out of enterprise status. And for that university to go back into enterprise status, they would have to be voted on. This actually was an interesting debate that happened at the title board hearing that, folks can actually go back and listen to sort of the legal arguments from Michael and his attorney on this. But that is one of the concerns. And I do believe that in Colorado, because we just talked about how smart our consumers are, that fee-based enterprises are user choice. And so that is part of why this is really important, because as we look at funding our government, making things work, people do need to have the ability to choose to use these things and to help fund them, because otherwise they aren't going to exist. And thinking about living in Lahana, Colorado without a hospital for an hour plus drive is a really scary proposition.
Great. Well, let's go back to Michael and then let Andrew weigh in on 117.
Well, I disagree. I wrote this and worked with Ledge Council to make sure that it didn't touch anything in the past. It is for new enterprises, and that 5-year clock is there for a reason. If anything that could re-qualify would happen, that clock would never hit, the 5 years. And so it's really, really clear that it doesn't touch anything in the past.
Okay, let's go to Andrew. Do you have anything to add on enterprise or?
Yeah, this one, I'm still looking into it. I'm curious how much of an effect it will have down the road. I mean, it obviously would have reshaped, if it were in place, the hospital provider fee debate. It would have reshaped this paid leave debate if that was something that had ended up going forward in the state legislature. And I don't know, I can see the point that these fees in some ways have become broader and broader in the way that the legislature has embraced them. If you look at the paid family leave, that's funded by a fee that's on most people's paycheck, and it's a 1% of your paycheck. Now, it qualifies as a fee because it's designated for a really specific use, which is funding the paid leave program. But you could certainly argue about how voluntary that really is, and how a percentage of your income really does sound a lot like a tax in some ways. But on the other hand, you're going to hear a lot of counter argument that this is the solution that the legislature has found to these fees, to try to find money for necessary programs, and that it's going to get even more complicated and have some major implications for our government if they don't have some flexibility to use these, call them alternative financial arrangements.
Well, thank you. That was a great discussion on the complicated fiscal issues that are out there. Just to touch on a couple of the others. So there's 115 is prohibiting abortions after 22 weeks. Obviously with the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade, there's a lot of thinking and discussion about the abortion issue and how that affects the election, whether it affects turnout. And maybe let's go backwards. Andrew, what do you see in that one for Colorado?
I've seen a number of people asking if that's going to be a turnout driver, or if any of these will drive turnout among conservatives or among Democrats. And I honestly don't think that any of them will, because I don't see why anyone would need any more motivation to vote, considering the intensity of this election so far. And again, these things are always a test of where Colorado's at and just how blue or purple or red it really is. I don't foresee it passing here, although I don't know. I don't have too many astute observations on that one.
Okay. Thanks. Michael, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And the turnout question, I think we're going to be close to full employment. Everybody who's ever going to vote is going to vote in this election. These ballot issues do give somebody one other push to do it, but they're going to vote anyway. So I don't think that drives turnout. I think with 115, I think in theory, a lot of people are against the late-term abortions that we're talking about. Most states put some kind of parameters around abortion. We're one of 7 states that doesn't. I think the reason why I think it has a hard time of passing is, that it gets thrown in with, no exceptions or bans or the personhood stuff that has gone down big in our state before. And so I think this will be a lot closer than the personhood ones. But I think, going into this, it's probably around even, but the anti-side has so much more money and is running so many more ads that I think it drags it down somewhere into the 40s. And then I think, do you see something like this again, slightly changed in the future or not? But I think you have passionate people on both sides of that issue.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Michael. Renee, what do you feel about that one?
Yeah, Colorado continues to say no to these ballot initiatives. And Michael may be right, this one may be closer, but I think Colorado continues to say no. We're not a state that likes government in between us and our doctor. And those decisions are sort of meant to be made at that level. So.
Okay, great. Just to finish up then on the ballot stuff, on the voting, so there's the Electoral College, one where we would join, I think, 20 or so other states that are out there with a whole total of about 187 electoral votes. And then if we get to 270, the popular vote would kind of replace the Electoral College. There's that one, and there's also the citizen qualifications moving from every citizen to only citizens, which I think is going to confuse a lot of people. So let's go backwards. And Renee, can you talk about those two?
Yeah, I actually want to start with 76 because I do believe this amendment could really confuse people. So this was put on the ballot by a sort of an out-of-state Florida group. There's not really a lot of supporters in Colorado that are behind this. The one big thing this does is Colorado, 2 years ago, I may be off a year, passed an initiative that allows our 17-year-olds to vote in primaries for the year that they would then be 18 to vote in the general. And that is really important, and especially in areas like where I live in Denver, where the primary is the race. And so this would actually prohibit them from being able to do that. And we need our young people involved and paying attention and being a part of this. I also think it's a bit of a dog whistle to some around immigration and anti-immigration issues. And it really sort of is trying to keep some voters who may have recently become citizens from worrying about whether they're actually eligible to vote or not. I think this one is a word. It literally changes one word in the Constitution in search of a problem that Colorado just doesn't have. Because frankly, and I know we're going to talk about Colorado voting in a bit, but Colorado is one of the best states to vote in. We don't have issues in our voting system. We don't see fraud. And I think that we just don't need 76. I saw Michael come off if you wanted to jump in.
Okay, Michael?
No, I don't disagree that I think just reading it that people will probably vote yes just because of how it sounds. I don't think it really has a big impact if 76 passes or doesn't pass. I don't think it has a huge policy impact. I think on the national popular vote, that's a really interesting one. I think with all these, ballot language matters so much. And if you read the ballot language, it sounds pretty good to vote yes on that one. I think it also has to do, anything that has to do with Trump is going to get an interesting response this year in Colorado. And so the fact that I think in a different year, you might have a different outcome on that. I still think that one's close, given, the fact that we would be giving away our electoral votes to what happens in other parts of the whole country. I think naturally Coloradans would be against that, but given the other political dynamics and given the ballot language, I think that one could pass. And so you'll see a lot of money being still spent on both sides of that issue. But again, it doesn't, it's not implemented until 270 electoral votes. I think there's be a constitutional challenge on if it's even legal if that happens. So there's a long way to go on national popular vote.
Yeah, and I think national popular vote is actually one people should support. One vote, one person, that sort of makes sense. And I think we've seen some elections turn on some of those consequences of the electoral college system. And it doesn't make sense. It's an outdated policy that we really need to work with everybody else. And we're not giving up our electoral votes. It would be changing the entire system and everybody would be one person, one vote. So.
Yeah, I noticed most of the other states that have passed this so far, maybe all of them are blue states effectively. So it's pushing from there. Andrew, do you have thoughts on those two?
Mm-hmm. The citizenship voting one, which, as was mentioned, basically changes the Constitution from saying every citizen may vote to only citizens may vote. I think that's one where the entire campaign is basically in the language of the ballot. Like, they've raised only $7,000 for that committee and spent almost none of it, as far as I can tell from campaign finance reports. It's really the act of getting it on the ballot that was the entire point of that. And then in terms of national popular vote, I'll be watching that one because that gets at the conversation we're going to be having in this country for a long time to come. Like, that, to me, symbolizes the growing divide over direct democracy versus the kind of the system that we have.
Okay, great. And there's a question on the chat about what it does. Does it require the vote for the national popular candidate instead of the state popular candidate?
No, so what it does is, Michael was correct, once enough states that represent 270 electors, then that system, it changes in the way that it works. So, does it require, sorry, I'm reading it, says electors will be required to vote for the national popular candidate instead of the state popular candidate. In the strictest sense, yes, but it would be a change in the way that the actual votes are counted and how that person wins.
So the popular, I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, if it were to ever be implemented in enough states that the whole thing kicks in, then our votes would be swung to the winner of the national popular vote. But the key is that would not happen until enough states agree that it has critical mass. So we would never be in a situation where, it's hard to explain, but it can only take effect when there are enough states doing it that it would be guaranteed to award those votes and the presidency to the winner of the national popular vote.
Okay, good. Well, that was a fabulous discussion of our complicated 11, or most of them, state ballot issues. I want to segue a little bit into our actual voting process. A couple of you have already mentioned, and this is a national issue. President Trump has raised it quite a bit about whether, our voting is legitimate, and particularly so with COVID and, people being concerned about turning out in person on election day in the states where that's normally been the way we voted. But in Colorado, we've had the mail-in ballot for a long time, and we'll get our ballots pretty soon. And we can send them through the U.S. mail. We can put them in ballot boxes. We can bring them into designated places. I think in 2018, we were the third highest turnout state. So it does seem associated with, a positive turnout. But do we have any concerns about the actual process of voting in Colorado and how that's going to play out and the timing? And maybe start with Andrew.
Yeah, beyond just Colorado, I think the number one thing that I'm concerned about is that as we have this expansion elsewhere of mail voting, that, we're going to have logistical hiccups. And my real fear is that those get amplified into broader conspiracy theories that allege like a much more intentional effort. And one way we've seen that happen, let me tell you a really quick anecdote. In West Virginia over the summer, a mailman was caught for some reason changing the markings on a handful of people's ballot request forms as a joke, apparently. And the result was that 5 people, instead of getting Democratic primary ballots, they would have gotten Republican primary ballots, except that he was promptly caught because it was like flagrant and stupid. But in the presidential debate, you saw President Trump pick up on that and turn this into a totally baseless and false story where there was a mailman supposedly selling ballots in West Virginia, and that this was part of his allegation that everything's going to be a big scam. Point being, as we see these very predictable and yes, concerning like screw-ups by the states as they try to expand it, that becomes fuel for a fire that is undermining our faith in the election system itself, with the president leading the charge. That's my concern.
Michael, your thoughts?
Well, first I want to make a plug for Purplish that that you guys just covered this, Andy, on Purplish this week. I think that was a good episode. I just listened to it a little while ago. But I think Colorado has a really good system. This will be, I think, our 7th year of all mail-in ballots. You obviously have your little mistakes that happen, when Adams County says to vote, 2 people and it's 1 or 2, and Arapahoe has had a couple issues here and there with their clerk, but overall, I think we should have a lot of confidence in our system here in Colorado. I do share some of the concerns of states that haven't done this before. They're trying to put this together during a pandemic. There are going to be some issues in other places. How substantial those are or what they look like. I'm just somebody who's going to look at evidence and see, is it one mailman who did 5 little things, or is there, something broader that could actually impact things? And so unless there's evidence on either side, I'm, not going to worry about it out of hand to start with. But I do think there will be challenges in places that haven't done this for 7 years, and we still, are always working on our system here. But I think in Colorado, we across the board have a lot of confidence in our system.
Renee?
Yeah, I don't think I need to take more time on that. Ditto. I think we are going to do a great job here in Colorado, and I think there will be hiccups across the country, but I think it will be small, and just like Andy was just talking about, one guy doing one small thing and he's going to get caught, because that is how the system works.
So, this is a big leap, but given that, are you concerned about other states around the country not having results on election night, and and running into something like Florida 2000, where it's going to be weeks of sorting through issues related to the ballots? Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that in certain states we don't know, because a large percentage will come in later. We have courts coming up with different dates, a week or 2 weeks later that things can count if they were postmarked. I think the rules being a little bit different across the board will make it interesting. I'm kind of hoping that whoever wins on election night and keeps their win throughout the time, just because I think that'll be easier than a flip. But I think the media is starting to do and is doing a really good job of getting the word out that, hey, this might not be decided, or likely won't be decided on election night. And so we're going to have to wait and see. And so I think that, setting it up that way is better than people just turning on TV thinking, hey, by midnight, we're going to know, if that's not the case. So I think expectations are a huge thing. But I also like to see some more consistency on the rules across the board, but knowing that each state has different elections and has different things going on, that's really tough to do. So I think the discussion about it, the fact that we're talking about it now, that the media is talking about it, is a good thing to try to keep confidence in that system.
Renee or Andrew on election night?
I think we also just got the question if the USPS will be reliable. And what I could say is, because we run a lot of campaigns, we actually are in the USPS a lot right now. And they are doing a great job here in Colorado. We are not seeing any issues at all with our mail getting delivered. And I think we're also, as a state, doing a really good job of telling folks, mail your ballot before the 26th. And if it's after the 26th, go put it in a drop box. And these drop boxes are open 24 hours and are secure. So I think that is a really important part that's going on well in Colorado. And I agree with Michael that the shift of all the rules in different states, we've actually started putting on all of our mail pieces that your ballot can't be postmarked, because a lot of people aren't understanding your ballot actually has to arrive by 7 p.m. on election day in Colorado, because other states have postmark deadlines. And so making sure that, we in Colorado are telling our folks the right way to vote is becoming very important.
Yeah, in terms of Clark's question about USPS reliability, my greatest concern there is just how we're going to deal with, if there are any mail delays, I could easily see the question of how those ballots are counted being the center of court battles afterward. I am hoping that this widespread messaging to vote early and to mail early will help to alleviate that problem. But again, the big concern for me is that in those days when we most likely don't know, how is misinformation weaponized, and what do our leaders do to keep the calm in probably the time of greatest question and greatest upset that we're going to see in quite a while.
Great. Well, it's good to know the Colorado system looks pretty strong, and hopefully other states will do a decent job as well as they do it more quickly. Let's move then to the election candidate issues. First of all, the presidential level. Most of the polls seem to show President Trump down by maybe double digits in Colorado. First of all, is there any chance that he could win the state? And secondly, if he is down by double digits, what does that mean for the the Senate race, which we'll get to, but also other down ballot things? Does it draw Republicans down with him a little bit, or can they sort of disassociate with that? So let's start with Michael on that one.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really thinks that the presidential race is competitive here. But I don't think that it'll end up being double digits. But it is a big difference between, is it a 9-point difference or a 5-point difference like it was last time? I think that could have a lot of impact down ballot, especially for Cory Gardner's race against Hickenlooper. I mean, if President Trump loses by 4 or 5 here, Cory has a shot of winning. If it's 9 or 10, it's just hard to overcome that kind of number. And so I think that will have an impact. It will have an impact on races all the way down, including state house, state senate, something like CD3, which does tends to lean more Trump than other places in the state. And so if Trump is winning by a significant margin there, that helps Lauren Boebert there. So there's definitely while nobody thinks that Biden's going to lose Colorado, the margin matters a whole lot in terms of other races.
Great. Renee, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up where Michael was, which is Biden will win Colorado, but I think the real impact will be interesting in the CD3 race. The last poll I had seen out of there had Trump Biden even in CD3, which also was making the Boebert Diane Mishbush race even. And I think that is where we're going to see the impact of what does that do on a down ballot race over in CD3.
Great. And just for our audience, most of you know this, but CD3 is kind of central western Colorado. Scott Tipton was the congressional rep for a number of years there. He very surprisingly lost his primary to Lauren Boebert, and kind of from the right, I'd say. And Diane Mishbush is the Democratic candidate who ran against Tipton 2 years ago and lost pretty significantly, 6 or 8 points, if I recall. But the polling looks like it might be about even. There's a lot of Democratic money, and that looks like a possible, pickup that the National Democrats think they might get. But let's move to Andrew on the Trump question and the down ballot too.
Yeah, something interesting about Trump in 2016 was that he lost to Clinton here by 5 percentage points or so, and a solid majority of that margin actually just voted third party. If all the Gary Johnson voters had gone for Trump instead, Gary Johnson Libertarian, then that would have been a closer race. I think that was partially a reflection of the fact that a lot of people didn't like Trump, but also a lot of voters just really detested Hillary Clinton for one reason or another. So that if that situation were to repeat and Trump were to lose by 6-7 percentage points, but a lot of them are third party voters, then there's a scenario where Cory Gardner can hold on because he is a politician who's able to convince people to split their tickets, which is how he got elected in the first place. But I could also pretty easily see a situation where Trump is losing by 10, and that really makes it almost impossible for a Cory Gardner to survive. CO3 will definitely, in my opinion, be the closest of the federal races that we'll see.
So Boebert and Mishbush kind of a toss-up. Most people think that's true or
Close, if not a toss-up. I don't know.
I still think it leans towards Boebert. Just and part of it, the reason is Mitch Bush isn't John Salazar, who was the last Democrat to have that. She's a little bit more, definitely more liberal, and obviously Lauren's more conservative. But I think I think Lauren Boebert's still favored, but it will be close. I think within a few points for sure.
What you're going to see is a lot of out-of-state money hammering Boebert on her personal record. A handful of arrests that didn't result in charges or jail time or anything, but for kind of like assorted misbehavior, essentially, missed taxes. So we're going to see whether this long attack on her character and her record is going to be enough to knock that towards the Democrats.
Renee, any thoughts on that race?
Well, I think in CD3, one of the interesting parts is, Paul, you described it as the western part, but it actually wraps all the way down in the southern, clear over to Pueblo. And frankly, Pueblo is the linchpin in that election. And they're very interesting in Pueblo because they sort of haven't had the same voting record year after year. So I was just trying to quickly scan and see what I could find as the numbers, but they voted Obama twice with a 14% margin, and then they voted for Trump with a 0.5 percentage point margin. And so I think we got to see what Pueblo does. And does Biden sort of cut through to the working man and working woman? Because that's who Pueblo is. That is a very working class community, and they work hard, and they want to know that they're being represented. So it's going to be interesting. I think that's really where it's going to come down to. And we've already talked about watching how votes get counted and that it might not be done on election night. I would say this one's going to actually be close enough. It's not done on election night, and will actually go into the following day or two.
Well, that's also a good segue. Excuse me, the Gardner-Hickenlooper Senate election, I believe they have their first debate tonight in Pueblo. That one, it looks like polls have Hickenlooper up as little as 5%, as much as 10%. Does that seem right? And is there a path for Gardner to pull that one off? Michael, unmuted, so we can start with Michael.
I think it'll be interesting to see these debates for sure. I think Cory Gardner's been waiting for these for a while. You'll see a couple of them in the next week or so between 9 News and 7. And so I think that will, should help Cory, given that I don't think Hickenlooper's that strong of a debater. There's no doubt that the ethics stuff really impacted Hickenlooper's primary campaign, and it's kind of flooded in to this. But again, if Trump has to have a narrow margin for Cory to have a shot on this, but I think it's really interesting because I think any other year Cory has a really, really good shot of getting re-election, given the fact that a lot of the stuff he's focused on has helped Colorado. Bureau of Land Management headquarters, Space Command, Outdoors Act. I mean, there's a lot of record. He's passed a lot of bills, been very bipartisan, a really good senator. But you can get caught up in wave elections, and I think that's what's going on right now. So what he has to do is focus in on, what he's brought back to Colorado, continue to go after Hickenlooper on ethics, and hope that presidential gap narrows. But I think there's no doubt, in these polls that it's showing Hickenlooper slightly favored.
Renee?
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree about whether Cory's done great things for the state. But I think the one piece that's going to change for this is, one, these debates, but number two, the Supreme Court appointment and sort of the hypocrisy around some of the statements he made in 2016. And so I think that is going to become even more impactful in this. And I think we're going to see that gap that maybe was starting to narrow a little bit. I think we're going to start seeing it widen back open.
Andrew, what do you think of that?
This is an opportunity to get on one of my favorite soapboxes, which is the nationalization of politics. What you've seen over the decades is that voters increasingly want to vote a straight ticket. If they're voting Biden at the top, they're going to vote Democrats all the way down. And that has a lot to do with the fact that voters increasingly just really hate the guts of the other party. That makes it really hard for Republicans to hold on in a state that's trending blue, whether you're Cory Gardner or whether you're a state senator in suburban Arapahoe County. So the challenge that sets up for Cory is trying to thread that needle, and you see it in his messaging. He talks a lot about, as Michael said, being bipartisan. he says, we may not agree, you and I, speaking to, Democratic voters, but I'm a good guy, you can support me. Speaking to Lenee's point, we'll see how the fact that he does align with Republicans on issues that are not popular with Democrats, such as seating a Supreme Court justice before the election's out. We'll see how that, does that square with the local guy image he's putting out. Which one are voters going to buy? And that'll determine his fate. Or Trump getting blown out by 15 points will determine his fate, and it won't matter anyway.
Okay, great points. We also have lots of state legislative elections. Too many to focus on probably individually, but the Democrats have held the Assembly and the Senate last couple of rounds. Most of the predictions are that they'll hold at least what they have now, possibly a little bit of gains at the margin. What are your thoughts on that one? Renee, you want to go in first?
Sure. So the Dems will for sure hold on to the House. I don't know that anybody's talking about that. I think most of it's centered around the Senate. Republicans would need to pick up 2 seats. There are really sort of 5 seats that people are watching in play. And I will tell you, I do not see a path for the Republicans to take back the Senate. I think we've got some pretty solid candidates that are all running, but I don't see a lot of those flipping.
Okay. Michael, state legislature.
Yeah, I think you'll definitely see Dem control of both the House and the Senate. They have a huge margin in the House right now. I could see Republicans picking up a seat or 2 that they lost in 2018, but maybe other ones being more competitive. So you might have a wash, given that there's a seat in Pueblo that I think will flip Republican, but some of these suburban areas of Jeffco and Arapahoe are really tough for Republicans right now. In the Senate, there are 3 Republican seats that are competitive that they're trying to hold on to. I think they probably hold on to 2 of them. And so you'll probably likely see a 20 to 15 majority for Democrats. And so, it's always interesting when you have Governor Polis, who is liberal on some issues, some fiscally conservative issues, and the back and forth that you see in the legislature because of that. But I think, Polis right now has to be looking at how do you not go so far to the left that when redistricting happens, and that's the big thing, is in 2 years, we're going to have redistricted, the maps are not going to look the way they are, a whole new system on that. And so that is what I think Republicans are looking for, is how do you hold enough this year, but then really try to build and scratch back in 2 years.
We, the voters, approved a much more independent redistricting process, 2 years ago? Or 4 years ago, I can't remember.
Yeah, which is just a big deal given, I think a lot of Democrats that might have supported that at the time didn't think they would have as much power as they do. And now, I think this really helps benefit, at least having a fair system would help benefit Republicans when they have no control over how those maps would be drawn otherwise.
Andrew, state legislature.
Yeah, I think Michael's thoughts on the numbers are probably going to turn out to be pretty accurate. It's a question of whether Democrats can push a little bit more into the conservative suburbs or whether it'll stay steady. I live in eastern Arvada, so I'm in Zenzinger's district, which was, I believe, a recent flip. And I'm getting 2 to 3 to 4 mailers a day on a lot of days. It's interesting to see the contrast. Zenzinger's obviously got a lot more money. She's the Democrat behind her. And, her opponent, Lynn Gerber, is running these like Common Sense Colorado, I'm a check on the Democrats, but she's getting hammered by outside funded mailers that are basically like, Lynn Gerber is a COVID denier and she's like a dangerous person who we don't know anything about. So again, you see that dynamic where local Republican candidates are trying to project that image of not necessarily being national Republicans, of being common sense local people, and Democrats are saying, no, you're not. Voters will make up their mind.
Great thoughts. So given all of that, I mean, as we know, in 2018, all the major Colorado positions went for the Democrats, and the legislature, it sounds like, is going to stay there. The only elected body that isn't democratically controlled is the CU Regents, Board of Regents, and there's some chance that'll flip if I think it's the CD6 seat might flip. That'll be an interesting race. But Andrew, you have your purplish podcast, and Eric Sonderman has said, well, maybe we're not purple anymore. We're leaning more blue. We're periwinkle, or whatever color in the crayon spectrum. And what do you all think about that? Is this just a pendulum swing, kind of anti-Trump and other things involved that have been favoring the Democrats the last few years, and it'll even out, or is it a longer term push of the state into the bluer categories?
I think demographically, we're definitely moving in the direction where it gets more and more favorable for Democrats as you get more like affluent young people moving into cities like Denver. But I always said I don't think that anything is permanent in politics. And, sooner or later, Republicans are going to find a winning formula, I would think, to, if not regain power, then at least stanch the bleeding. And you see the opportunity just in the way that voters continue to not like tax increases. Like, I don't know, maybe a straight fiscal conservative message will have some traction here one day. But point being, like, state of the country's politics right now, I wouldn't expect either party to be stable and look exactly the same in 10 years. So you therefore can't say anything about Colorado voting the same way forever.
Great thoughts. Michael, what do you think about that? You're fighting for a lot of Republican candidates and causes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's leaning Democratic pretty heavily right now. 2018, this year is going to be a tough year too for Republicans in the state. But I think overall, it comes down to the economy, and the economy still, for the last few years, we've had the #1 economy in the country. Does that continue or not? And if we start slipping, if oil and gas leaves the state, if businesses start getting moving to other places, et cetera, I think you'll see a shift back. Right now, you have it where the voters can be fiscally conservative and we have the #1 economy and then vote for Democrats. I think that's their option right now. Will that continue to be an option if you have Democrats in complete control moving further and further to the left? And so I think there's thinking about what happens on the national stage is going to be really important for Colorado too. Does Biden win? Does Trump win? Do they have complete control? Democrats at the national level and the state level, you're going to see a pushback in 2022, and I think that's when Republicans have the biggest opportunity. Obviously, if this president wins again and Republicans keep the Senate, it could be a rough year for Republicans in 2022 here. So I think a lot of it is yet to be seen, but I would watch our rankings in the economy and the way things are going compared to other states as we recover. I think that'll have a big impact.
Renee, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's about the economy, but it's also about how the economy is being built back. And I'm going to come full circle because it's also where I started. I think that as we look at rebuilding Colorado's economy, making sure that the low-paid employees are not left behind when we fix our economy is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the Dems. And I think they're up for that challenge. And I think we're going to see them be able to help rebalance our economy in a way where it's not just the rich getting richer, but it's the whole state prospering. And I think that will make the difference of the Dems being able to stay in this control.
Andrew, did you want to jump on?
Sorry, I couldn't figure out my computer. Renee's comment makes me think that at least in the short term, it's also the question of what flavor of blue will the state be. If you see a bunch more Senate pickups and you see the Democrats in the Senate get more successful in organizing on like labor stuff, that presents a different equation because we have a governor who has tried to split the middle, on issues like paid family leave. The reason that's on the ballot in large part is that Governor Polis threw them a curveball and said he didn't want to go for the model they're approaching. He wanted a private mandate that is more in line with his kind of libertarian streak. It's going to get a lot harder for him to do that if labor-oriented Democrats take more power in the state Senate. And so, just because you see a lot of Ds getting elected doesn't mean that the politics aren't changing.
Those are great points. Thank you. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. There's still about 100 people on board if people want to start putting questions up there. But I did want to ask our panelists a last question. It's, what will we be talking about on November 4th, November 3rd, Tuesday, the election? We already said we may or may not know everything or anything, maybe even about the national presidential race. But what'll be the big topic, do you think, in Colorado later that week? Let's start with Andrew.
Well, in terms of Colorado, maybe it'll hopefully be that we have results and nobody else has them, and so people will be at least maybe there'll be a lot of attention on us because people just want to hear from somewhere that's got it figured out. But I don't know. I think it's going to be. I'm not looking forward to November, December, the conversation, the rhetoric, anything. So I think it's going to be hunker down for a couple weeks mode for a lot of people.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, November 4th, I'll be hanging out with my new baby a lot more, not worrying about any of it. But I do kind of going back to, I think a lot of it will depend on what happens both nationally and in Colorado, and how much do Democrats have complete control. I think it's very likely that the presidency, whoever wins the presidency, will also win the Senate. And I think that has a big, is there going to be gridlock, or is there going to be Democrats passing everything? And I think that will impact things here in Colorado. I think the Supreme Court will still be a discussion. If Amy Coney Barrett gets through, it'll be, within the days before the election, and then the election will happen. There'll be more talk about that. I know the ACA is up in the week after the election, and cases are going to start coming. And so I think the Supreme Court will be a big thing. Here in Colorado, I don't know if a whole lot fundamentally changes, given that we already have Dem control and kind of a roadmap for where they're headed. And then I think the longer term question will be, is that going to be in a positive direction or negative for our state?
Good. Renee?
I'm hoping that after the election, we're shifting our conversation from being so divisive into finding a way forward, because I can't take much more. And I work in this world. So for me to say that, I can only imagine what the average person is feeling. But sort of the divisiveness, both on the local, but mostly at the national level, really is something I hope that we're talking about and really figuring out how to heal our country back afterwards.
I mean, not to be overblown, but I do think we're going to need a truth and reconciliation moment at some point. Like, it's there's some divergent realities going on, and I'm very curious about what the president does if the results don't go his way, because he's given not a lot of indications of giving up that seat without a long legal fight. I'm also expecting a kid on November 5th. I forgot about that. So me and Michael will be in the same boat, watching and not getting any sleep.
That's awesome. Congratulations to both of you. And so that's sort of, we're done with our normal time period here. We can hang on for some questions. First of all, I want to thank all of you on the panel, thank our audience. There is one question up that asks, what do you all think of Governor Polis's response to COVID, and how does that affect the election? So I think that's and more generally, how does that affect maybe Polis now and 2 years down the road, if I could add to that. Renee?
So maybe just really quick, Dean Teske, before people jump off, can we just encourage everybody, just go check, make sure you're registered. It's very easy to do, and make sure that the address is correct so that your ballot's getting mailed to you. And then please just return it as soon as possible, because I think everybody on this panel is correct, and Colorado will do a great job, but it would be really nice for us to be done on election night. And not having questions hang out there. So just, it's very easy. Vote.gov, I believe, takes you straight over to the Secretary of State's site and lets you check. And now I forgot what the question was.
Polis and COVID, how well has he done? How does that affect this election or future ones?
I have been incredibly proud of the way the governor has dealt with this crisis. I think that they have done a very good job of communicating. He was actually on live as we were coming onto this panel, so I don't know exactly what he said today. But I think he has shown leadership, which has been lacking at the national level, and which we needed here. I think we've also gotten to a place where we have data that shows us where and what is going on. We have some interesting hotspots showing up in northeastern Colorado right now that, allows us to know that they're there, and we can start talking about and thinking about how to help fix a couple of those hotspot counties up there. For my own alma maters, for CU Boulder, we need to really get ourselves under control over there. But I will say, I think it has also added a little bit to the divisiveness. I said I was from southeastern Colorado, and one of the interesting things to follow on my Facebook page is actually my family and friends from down there who really believe that we have locked the economy down too tight, and masks shouldn't be required, and it's creating another sense of division. And so I look forward to us actually getting past the election so that maybe the conversation can actually be about public health instead of always about the politics. So that's sort of my hope, but I do think that he has done a good job, and I think that many people survived through this because of the leadership we've seen in our state.
Thank you, Renee. Michael?
I think a lot of times in terms of response on COVID that you hear from the extremes of people thinking that Polis locked things down too long or too much, and then the other side saying he didn't do enough on it. I think if you look at the polling on it, that his response, the most people think that it's been reasonable, that it's been pretty good. I mean, he's in the high 50s, I think the last time I saw on that, which is a pretty good number for Colorado. He was obviously one of the Democratic governors who was pushing forward to open certain things up quicker than other places. And so I think, he is somebody who's economically minded, but also scientifically minded. He's sitting up there talking about masks all the time and talking about how important social distancing is. And so I think, any governor, any leader in this kind of situation is going to take a lot of heat for whatever decision you make. He started out very local control, then moved a little bit more towards state. And so you have all these responses. But I think overall that he's done a pretty good job given the circumstances and given how much this is changing all the time.
Thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, I'd love to read a case study after the fact on kind of how he chose to communicate. He decided early on that he was going to get in front of cameras on a Facebook live stream and do these hour-long talks where he's kind of talking to reporters, but mostly talking to people. I think that probably boosted the way that people thought of him, because he did, one of the main things you can do as an executive in these situations is to just be the person that people attach to it. And he really pressed this message that it was going to be data-based. Like Michael said, he did try to hand over a fair amount of the authority to the localities, which annoyed many critics to his left. He's been slow to do things like ban evictions, not really willing to do that. He was hesitant, actually, to issue a statewide mask order because he's really tried to frame it in a way that he's putting out the big message and letting local leaders kind of either take the heat or take the responsibility, whichever one you want to put it. And I think that seemed to work out pretty well for him, although you're naturally going to see criticism from people who don't believe that any restriction is necessary, and some members of some conservative members of the government have gone after him on the basis of being a tyrant and what have you. But I think the numbers will bear it out. Michael, did you say high 50s? I didn't know there was polling on that.
I don't know if it was public polling, but I've seen the response on it, and it was 56 to it was in this low 60s to start out with. It kind of went to high 50s. Other people could have other polling on it, but that's not bad polling in Colorado.
The most interesting thing about his response to me was watching when he would do the mask order or whatever, and people would come to him and say, "Why are you being such a tyrant? Why are you trying to control what I would do?" And he always had like a pretty decent canned response where he'd be like, "I'm not telling you what to do. Like you can make up your own mind. Don't." What did he? Do you guys remember this? He was like, essentially like, don't feel like you're pulling one over on old Jared Polis, or don't feel like you're rebelling against me. You're just disobeying common sense. So he tried to pass it off where it wasn't about, the people versus Polis. It was just him trying to share good advice was how he portrayed it.
Renee, did you want to jump in on that, or?
No, I was gonna agree. We've seen polling with the high 80s, low 60s as well. So.
Well, I think we've answered the audience questions, done a great job covering our topic. So I just want to thank you, Andrew, Renee, Michael, for great comments, great thoughts. We're in an interesting time in every way, shape, and form, and I think you've really helped our audience, understand that and think about it. And so I just want to thank you so much. And everybody that's still on, as Lene said, vote, pay attention, tell others to vote, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully, hopefully the outcomes are good over the next couple of months, in whatever good means at this point, but better than they've been for the rest of 2020. So,
well, thanks, Paul. And I'm easy to find, so look me up, email me questions, let me know what you're seeing.
Sounds good.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.